So he was questioned for over 7 hours the first night that Laci went missing.
He just doesn't seem like the guy whose wife is missing. His demeanor was suspicious.
We began immediate search of the park and river areas.
I always blame the husband, and I am almost always right. I start with the presumption that the husband did it, but there were alternative theories.
One is she was kidnapped by a satanic cult. Another one was a burglary that was across the street from the Peterson home. I mean, it's true the police needed to look at other possibilities, but they needed to stay on Scott. They needed to do what they did.
There's absolutely no physical evidence at all that Scott committed this crime.
We pretty much dealt with all of the satanic cults, the dog walkers. The only thing we couldn't eliminate was Scott.
Earlier this week, the Modesto Police Department was made aware of an article that was to appear in the National Enquirer, revealing new information regarding Laci's case. Family members were shown very recent pictures of Scott and a girlfriend.
There's pictures of you and the girl together. So we know that's true, right?
Yeah, there was an encounter.
What can you tell me about my sister to make me understand that you're telling the truth and that I can still support you?
Yeah, I don't know if you can believe me. I certainly hope you can. I hope you know me well enough.
You have nothing to do with this.
I have nothing to do with her disappearance, friend. So I wish I knew where she was.
Whoever has her, please, please, please let her go. Bring her back.
We love her so much. We want her back. Please, let us have her back.
I really liked him and felt really good about where things were going and our conversations and time spent together.
At the end of our last episode, Scott went back over his travel schedule for the next several weeks with his new girlfriend, Amber Frey. It was the 15th of December, and though they certainly didn't know it at the time, she and Scott wouldn't meet again until a year and a half later, on opposite sides of a courtroom. He'd narrowly averted disaster when she learned about his marriage the week before, but after successfully convincing Amber he was a broken-hearted widower living alone in Sacramento, he was back in her good graces. The despicable lie about his dead wife was working out perfectly for Scott so far. Between his awkward displays of grief and Amber's sympathy, he built an uncomfortable wall that prevented her from asking questions, and of course, he didn't offer up any details. He'd been telling her about his travel plans since the first night they met, making it clear that he'd be conveniently unavailable through the end of January. He had business planned in New Mexico and Arizona, before traveling to Maine for a duck hunting trip over Christmas. And then he was off to Paris on the 28th, to celebrate the New Year with friends before traveling between Brussels and Belgium. He said the main reason for the extended trip overseas was to work out a way to cut some of the travel out of his schedule, enabling him to get more time with her. Amber didn't expect to see him again for 6 weeks, but he promised when he returned, they would resume their relationship. When he left her place a little after noon on the 15th, she was disappointed that he never seemed to be able to stay long, but excited for her future with him, believing Scott was the prince she and Ayanna had been waiting for. She put her faith in him on the line the next day as she mailed out her Christmas cards, including a photo of them together in each envelope. She'd already introduced him to several people she knew at the fundraiser the night before, officially branding him her boyfriend, and was ready to announce her new commitment with Scott to her entire circle of friends and family. Little did she know that when he left Fresno, he hadn't gone anywhere near New Mexico, Arizona, Maine, or Europe, but back home to his wife Laci. In fact, on that particular evening, she was waiting for him to prepare the lasagna so they could host dinner for his in-laws, and he was late. He finally arrived home in Modesto sometime after Laci put a frozen lasagna in the oven, and Ron and Sharon had been there for a while by the time he showed up. They sat down to dinner together, and Sharon asked him how his trip to San Francisco went. She wondered if the drive was tricky in the nasty weather, but when she said it, He cocked his head to the side and paused for a second as if he wasn't sure what she meant. But an instant later he answered with a quick, "It was okay." Then he changed the subject with a toast to Sharon, raising his wine glass and saying, quote, "I want to make a toast to Mom, for having such a wonderful daughter." End quote. Sharon also asked him about his family's plans for the holidays, wondering if he and Lacey would be seeing the rest of the Petersons over Christmas. He made an unpleasant face that answered her question, and said something about how dysfunctional his family was. Sharon heard him make comments about family members before, but never about his family as a whole, and she wondered if he might be wrestling with something, but she couldn't have imagined the burden of lies and stress he'd been carrying until a month later, when Bueller and Brocchini revealed where he had been just hours before. She now understood why he'd taken a last-minute trip out of town, canceling plans with his pregnant wife, and it was plain to her now that his sleepover with Amber was the reason why he'd been too late to make his lasagna for dinner. His random toast after she mentioned the treacherous drive to San Francisco made more sense to her now as well, opening her eyes to some of his manipulative tricks in the process. Reflecting on the last night she spent with her daughter, filtered through the lens of Scott's lies, she was heartbroken, vividly recalling Lacey's words about his aversion to feeling baby Connor move, and terrified knowing either of them mentioned a word about his new boat. He'd had every opportunity to bring it up, with Ron telling Scott all about Sharon's rare fishing trip to Oakdale with him that morning, and recalling Scott's odd explanation about waiting for Christmas to share the news about the boat, hadn't made sense to her from the moment he said it. Now knowing Scott was rolling out of Amber Fry's bed around the same time she and Ron wrapped up their unsuccessful fishing trip on the 15th, Sharon thought back in time, remembering other strange things about Scott that could have been red flags she'd missed. For instance, she began to suspect he may have destroyed Connor's sonogram photo. Sharon remembered Lacey coming into her house in tears on the afternoon of September 24th, upset because she couldn't find it. She'd been to the doctor's office to have her routine prenatal visit and complete her 20-week ultrasound, which is also routine for most pregnancies. They'd given her the photo from the sonogram, and she'd only been home and to the store before going to her mother's house, excited to show Sharon her new grandson. But she was in tears at the door when it wasn't on the front seat of her car where she thought she'd left it. It was unlike Lacey to misplace something so precious, and she and Sharon retraced her steps to find baby Connor's first picture, searching the parking lot outside of the one place she'd stopped, but had no luck. Thankfully, Lacey was able to replace it so the family has a photo of Connor to hold on to, but Sharon couldn't help but wonder if Scott may have destroyed the original. Then she thought back to Lacey's dizzy spells and her nausea throughout November and felt ill as she considered whether that may have been Scott's doing as well. With nothing to stop her mind from imagining the worst, she wondered whether he may have been poisoning Lacey. If he'd intended for her to miscarry or something much worse, she didn't know, but she thought his plan with the boat and the anchors may have come after his attempts to poison her failed. It's also interesting to consider whether or not he may have had a hand in their struggle to conceive in the first place. Lacey tried desperately to get pregnant for nearly 2 years with no luck, until just before she decided to consult a fertility specialist. Remarkably, it was just before setting the appointment to investigate the cause of her infertility, likely involving blood tests and urine samples, that Lacey finally took her positive pregnancy test in June. There was never any evidence of poisoning, and several friends and even some members of Lacey's family testified that he was excited for the baby. Others confirmed that he worked hard to time his travels around her ovulation schedule to make it happen. Those things aside, Sharon firmly believes Scott planned her murder. She's only uncertain about how long and how deep his treachery ran. What remains most difficult for her to understand is why. She believes that Scott detached from Lacey, that he was able to stop caring about her as if flipping a switch, cutting Mackenzie off around the same time. From that perspective, it made perfect sense to her now why he'd pushed Lacey to leave the dog outside during their trip to Carmel on the 16th. It was a callous reflection of his disconnection from the dog, a disposition she believes later led him to dispose of his wife as well. The day Scott and Lacey left Modesto for Carmel, having Sharon come to feed Mackenzie, Gracie and Siam, their 2 cats, he and Amber exchanged 5 phone calls, although Amber's book only mentions receiving one missed call from Scott that day. But he'd left her a message, and she'd listened to that message several times just to hear his voice, mailing her special Christmas cards a few hours later. Phone records reflect 4 calls exchanged between Amber and Scott while he was in Carmel with Lacey and his parents on the 17th, and according to his father, they appeared to be happy as ever, saying he never saw a couple more in love. It was the last time Jackie and Lee Peterson ever saw their daughter-in-law. Back in Modesto on the 17th, Sharon tried to make Mackenzie more comfortable in the yard on Covina over the next 2 days. Knowing how cold it was getting at night, she wanted him to be able to lie next to the French doors close to the house. She hoped some of the heat from inside would radiate through the glass, offering him a bit of warmth. She moved a wood pallet away from the threshold of the door so the dog could get closer. Lacey later told her Scott had it there for a reason and he put it back as soon as they returned home. Sharon's always wondered why Scott wanted that wood there, suffering through dark visions of Lacey lying dead on that pallet, making it easier for him to dispose of her and her grandson. Amber didn't hear from Scott again until the 19th of December when he and Lacey returned home to Modesto, but they exchanged 8 calls that day, a higher number than usual. They talked again on the 20th, but the call was brief, just long enough for him to tell her he was still in New Mexico and that the cell signal was bad. He promised to call her again that evening, but never did. Of course, Scott wasn't in New Mexico that day, but at the Big 5 sporting goods store in Modesto, buying a saltwater fishing pole, lures, and a 2-day fishing license. The fishing license was only good the 23rd and 24th of December, but to be fair, a seasonal license wasn't an option because they were sold out for the year. The date issued says the 23rd of December, but this is a mistake. Although it was issued on the 20th, an inexperienced Big 5 employee wrote down the wrong date. It's not known whether Lacey was with Scott during his trip to the sporting goods store, but according to Peggy O'Donnell, she was with him at the warehouse that day. Peggy recalled letting Lacey use her restroom, because Scott's bay was so full he had to climb over things to get to his. Peggy O'Donnell never testified, and the notes from her interview with detectives 10 days later weren't admitted at trial. It's unknown whether Lacey ever went into Scott's warehouse or if she ever saw the boat, but it's possible that even if she did, he could have come up with a convincing reason for her to keep it to herself. Scott's always insisted Lacey knew about the boat and that she'd seen it on the 20th, but if she did, she never mentioned it to anyone. On the 21st, Amber told him how much she missed him, and how important it was to hear from him while they were apart. He apologized for being unavailable, promised to call the next day when he was back home in Sacramento, and blamed the poor reception on his phone, an excuse he used with Amber multiple times over the following weeks. That same night, Amber also talked to her Fresno detective friend Richard Bird for an hour. Bird offered to look into Scott for her, but she said it was more of a joke at the time, which seems like a missed opportunity. A quick search by Detective Bird would have been the perfect way to answer the uncomfortable questions she still had about Scott, but she said she didn't ask for his help, yet. For Sharon, the 21st of December coincides with another opportunity lost, though it was far more heartbreaking. She'd made several batches of Christmas cookies that day, and thought to surprise Lacey by dropping off a box intended for her and Scott. But at the last minute Sharon decided to call her first, rather than show up at the house unannounced. But when she did, Lacey told her not to bring cookies because she would most definitely eat them, and she was already fretting over her weight gain with Connor. Sharon will likely go to her grave with regrets about making that call to her daughter, forever wishing she'd dropped by with no warning, knowing it would have meant one last chance to see Lacey. Scott called Amber on the 22nd as promised, and they took up some serious topics for being all of 1 month into their relationship. He said he was at the airport in Oakland, waiting to board a flight to Kennebunkport, Maine to join his family for their Christmas duck hunt. She mentioned she would be going on birth control in preparation for his return, even though she loathed the side effects. He told her not to bother dealing with the pill, that he would just have a vasectomy when he got back, telling her again that he'd be satisfied raising Ayana, and was still disinterested in having biological children of his own. They talked about whether the operation was permanent or not, and he said they should consult the doctor when he returned from Europe. Amber was upset by the conversation, and before she changed the subject, he said he wished he could be there to comfort her as she cried. Of course, she and Scott never made a trip to the vasectomy doctor when he got back home to Sacramento, partially because there was no trip to Maine, Europe, or anywhere else, but mainly because he already had a baby on the way where he really lived, in Modesto. He and his pregnant wife worked to beautify the home they shared on Covina Avenue that same day, with Scott doing most of the work, while Lacey directed him where to plant their new flowers. He'd also played the good neighbor that afternoon, taking a break from mowing the lawn, to help Karen Service bring in the Christmas tree she brought home for her and her son. The following day, he called Amber again. It was the 23rd now, and Scott told her his delayed flight had finally arrived in Maine, but she heard the sound of water running in the background, as she had with several of the calls she received from him previously. It had happened so frequently, she'd asked him about it on more than one occasion. One time he told her he was in the hot tub, having to run naked to answer her call in time, and on the 23rd he told her he was calling her from the bathtub in the cabin. When she asked why, he said he was most comfortable and relaxed around water. In reality, he and Lacey were going about their normal routines in Modesto, but Amber began to suspect he might be squirreled away in the bathroom, using the water to hide their calls from another woman, possibly from his wife. Scott would later tell the world that Lacey knew about the affair since early December, but moments later he'd also claimed he told the police about it hours after she vanished, which is far from true. He would eventually tell Amber that Lacey knew about everything from the very beginning, claiming that he'd told his wife about his girlfriend on November 20th, before they went on their first date. But when she asked him why in the world he would tell her such elaborate lies and work so hard to hide their relationship, if Lacey'd always known the truth, and he was speechless. Lacey certainly didn't seem as though she'd learned Scott was cheating on her as she was nearly ready to bear their first child, whether it was November or December. There was no mention of marital issues of any kind, and Lacey seemed as bubbly and upbeat as ever, although maybe a little tired. But she'd suffered through his infidelity in silence before, knowing full well he was cheating with Janet Isle, and not breathing a word of the affair to anyone. On the off chance she did know about Amber, Lacey never let it show, and on the 23rd of December she went along with her quiet life with her charming husband, prepping for Christmas and counting the days until she could hold her new baby. She'd greeted their new housekeeper Margarita Nava at the house that morning, done her shopping at Trader Joe's, visited the spa for a wax, and gone to her last prenatal appointment that afternoon. Scott worked his normal hours at the warehouse that day, and aside from opening the post office box for Trade Corp and stopping home to pick up a FedEx delivery late that morning, his day was fairly routine as well. He and Lacey reunited that evening, when they met at Salon to have her sister Amy cut his hair. They grabbed a carry-out pizza and headed home for a quiet evening in front of the TV. But when Amber called him on the 23rd and she heard the water again, her suspicions began to grow. She was already distrustful after he'd given her a Modesto address to mail his Christmas gifts, and found herself feeling guilty for doubting him, but she couldn't help it. She knew he had a warehouse there, but he was heading to Europe, and even though he told her the P.O. box was actually an international courier, and that they would overnight the contents to him wherever he traveled, that didn't make much sense. But she wanted to believe him, and she continued working on the scarf she was knitting for him and putting the finishing touches on the ornament with their picture she intended to mail him for Christmas, hoping the package would successfully make it from Modesto to Paris like he said it would, but she was conflicted. She even began to doubt herself, wondering if her mistrust in others was at the root of her anxiety over Scott. She prayed for God to give her clarity and discernment, but a few days later, she'd be completely overwhelmed and unprepared when she learned the truth. Amber had the most terrifying nightmare of her life that night. In her dream, Ayanna was being choked and smothered by a brunette man whose face she couldn't see. Her feet stuck to the floor as she watched her daughter struggle, helpless to save her. Suddenly, a woman's face appeared out of the shadows, framed in long dark curls and wearing a broad smile. The woman began to laugh hysterically as Ayanna struggled, while Amber begged and screamed for both of them to stop. She awoke at sunrise on Christmas Eve, breathless and shaking as she recovered from the horrifically vivid dream, not used to having nightmares. Back in Modesto, Sharon was at the movies with her girlfriend Sandy that morning, while Ron picked up his paycheck and took a trip to a job site in Lodi. According to Scott, he and Lacey watched Martha Stewart before he left to test out his new boat. Scott and Amber didn't speak at all on the 24th, although he'd promised to call. Around the time Scott was driving home from his fishing trip to Berkeley, Detective Richard Bird invited Amber to a dinner party in Fresno, but shortly after they arrived, Ron called 911 dispatch to report Lacey missing. You might think there'd be a break in Scott's communication with Amber after his wife went missing. You might assume that whether he was involved or not, he'd be overwhelmed in every sense. And you might think that even if he did call her, his panic and fear would carry over through his voice, again, whether he'd had something to do with it or not. But if we assumed those things, we'd be wrong on all counts, because he called Amber Christmas morning, with fresh details about his trip to Maine. She didn't notice a hint of alarm or terror in his voice as he continued to pretend to be in Kennebunkport, telling her he'd just returned from a hike. Sounding perfectly normal as he described a white bunny hopping through the snow, but he did cut their conversation off abruptly, likely interrupted by the chaos surrounding his pregnant wife's disappearance the day before, telling Amber, "I have to go now, I'll call you later," before suddenly hanging up. Interestingly, Amber had already heard from Detective Bird on Christmas morning as well, talking to him for around 20 minutes just before Scott called her at 9 o'clock. Scott rushed off the phone with her Christmas morning, and though it wasn't the last conversation they'd have that day, she didn't hear from him until 12 hours later, and it had taken a bit of ridicule from one of her male friends to get him to call her back. Amber spent the holiday with close friends she named Paul and Lauren Benson in her book, a married couple she considered to be like family, but the Benson name was only used in her book for privacy. She'd actually spent the day with her best friend, Sean Sibley, at the home of her uncle, Doug Sibley. While there, she and Sean had another conversation about Scott, and when she still hadn't heard from him by late afternoon, she was disappointed that he wasn't more available for her and still wondering deep down if she could trust him, but she told Sean on Christmas Day how badly she hoped he was the one, trying hard to look past her doubts. The other partygoers must have overheard the complaints about her unattentive boyfriend, because around 6 o'clock, one of the men took Amber's phone and called Scott to give him a piece of his mind. In her book, it's Paul Benson who saw she was upset and called Scott to tell him not to make promises to women that he didn't intend to keep. But at trial, she testified it was Doug Sibley who'd left Scott a voicemail, lecturing about not calling Amber on Christmas when he said he would. It seems he hadn't made Amber a high priority as the search for Lacey ramped up on Christmas Day, although he may not have had much choice. With mounting numbers of family, friends, neighbors and police surrounding Scott that day, a moment alone to call his girlfriend was probably difficult if not impossible to find. This is evidenced by the fact that when he finally did respond to Doug Sibley's voicemail, calling Amber just before 8:30 that night, he wasn't alone. She heard a woman's voice in the background saying his name, and Amber instantly became suspicious. Even after he told her it was his mother, she wondered if the voice could belong to another lover or his wife. But the painful reality was that Amber needn't worry, because the one voice she certainly hadn't heard that day was his wife, Lacey's. It is widely believed that by the time Amber fretted over the woman with Scott on Christmas Day, the horrid lie he'd told her about his wife's death had tragically morphed into the truth. Of course, Amber still had no inkling of the turmoil that had developed in Modesto since Lacey's disappearance on Christmas Eve. It's obvious from the letter she wrote Scott that night, she had no idea Lacey Peterson even existed, putting pen to paper around the same time Sharon Rocha fell to pieces, as the helicopter called off the search for her daughter in the park. The following is a portion of the letter Amber wrote, after not hearing from Scott on Christmas Eve. Dear Scott, Ayana is asleep now, it's 10:28 p.m. and everything is ready for tomorrow. I already miss you, you didn't call like you said you would. I just hope you're having a good time with your family. Did I mention that I miss you? It's hard for me to believe I'm not going to be seeing you for another 5 weeks. That's roughly 55 days or so. I know it's not that long, but that's already longer than I've known you now. Do you think you'll meet someone while you're gone and be tempted? Do you know any women where you're going that you have an attraction to? I feel so lost, I really don't know what your world is like. I would like to go to Sacramento with you when you get back and spend some time on your grounds, and meet your friends too. My heart hurts when I talk to you on the phone, and I really don't want to be sad or down when I talk to you. I need to work on that. I'm happy for you that you've got to spend time with your brother, dad, and uncle for Thanksgiving, and now your mom and dad for Christmas. You know I feel sad because I feel lonely inside, and that I wish you were spending these times with me too. I don't feel included in your life yet. I know everything is still new. Are things always going to be like this, you gone or rushing off even on the phone? Because I need more in my life. I hate not knowing when I'm going to hear from you again. How can I, or we, deal with that? Not care? That certainly would hurt less. Working on loving you. Amber. It's obvious she had concerns about several things as she wrote, but judging from the phone activity 2 days later, the lack of communication from Scott was at the top of her list. She tried to call him 14 times that day, but between the search warrant being executed on his house, and the opening of the volunteer center in Modesto that afternoon, he'd only found time to return 2 of her 14 calls on the 26th. But she'd also received a package from Scott that day, a Christmas gift for Ayanna she wanted to thank him for, and when they finally connected she found it difficult to be too frustrated over the missed calls. He seemed a little concerned when she couldn't find the note he'd included with the gift, but when she told him she was only able to find an invoice, his voice tensed up. He said, "Invoice?" There wasn't supposed to be an invoice, just a note. But it wasn't the receipt for the gift that had caused her concern, it was the box it arrived in, or rather, the address it was mailed from. It was while searching the box for the note that she noticed the package was shipped from Emerald Avenue in Modesto, and it immediately stood out to her as strange, but it's unclear why she thought that was suspicious. She knew he kept a warehouse and a post office box there, but she still thought something was shady about the address, though by the time she heard what he'd written in the note, she was feeling guilty for not trusting him again. Here he was, generously sending her daughter a lovely gift, a star projector that displayed the constellations of the night sky onto the walls and ceiling for Ayanna, which she absolutely loved, and all she could do was question whether he'd lied about why it shipped from Modesto, and she felt terrible for being so distrustful. For some reason the note was written in Spanish, which Amber didn't speak, and he had to translate it for her. The note read as follows. To my girls, the angels are watching over you. Where's the first star in the sky? The gift and the note were a reference to stargazing in his truck with Ayanna, watching the sky for the first star to appear after their hike up to Squaws Leap during their second date. Amber was impressed with the thoughtfulness of the gift and the sweet sentiment of his note, and she was right back under his charming spell by the time he'd finished reading it. The 26th of December was another day of devastation for Sharon in Modesto. The volunteer center opened at the Red Lion Hotel, Scott's parents arrived in town, and the scent dogs were brought in by the sheriff's department. The Modesto Bee published their first article about Laci Peterson that morning, and Scott walked out of the first major press conference that afternoon. The family was able to announce the $100,000 reward and show Laci's picture to a national audience, but when it came time for questions from reporters, Scott walked out, frustrated after several of them focused on his possible involvement, and he never participated in another press conference afterward. He always maintained that his goal was to keep the focus on Laci rather than himself, but his dodgy behavior with the media only made him look more suspicious. On the 27th, Scott called in a couple of tips to Detective John Bueller, and patrol officers interviewed a woman who thought she saw Laci being harassed in the park that morning, while Amber made plans to take a vacation to Hawaii with an unnamed male friend. But after hearing a strange story from Scott about an airport massage on the 28th, Amber suspected he was lying to her again and canceled her vacation to investigate. He told her he was traveling to New York to catch an early flight to Europe that morning, and she rang his cell phone intending to leave a message, knowing he wouldn't get it until his plane touched down in Paris. Wanting her voice to be the first one he heard after stepping off the plane, she prepared to record something encouraging and sweet on his voicemail, but was surprised when he answered the phone. Initially he couldn't hear her, or pretended not to and hung up, but he called her right back. Of course, she wondered why he wasn't halfway over the Atlantic by then, but after he told her his 8:30 flight was delayed, she wondered why he hadn't called her all day. He said he was just wandering around the airport checking things out, thinking about things. "Were you thinking at all about me?" she said. She was obviously displeased, but when he asked what was wrong, she apologized, telling him she had trust issues and didn't want to take her baggage out on him. But he told her, "You don't have to apologize for that. I should have called, I should have been more understanding, and I wasn't sensitive to your needs." Then she asked if he recalled the conversation they'd had over the last night they'd spent together, when he told her he was monogamous and that she was his only sweetheart. "Of course I remember," he said, "and nothing has changed. On the contrary, we're stronger than ever. We have a future together, Amber, and I'm not going to do anything to mess it up." She told him how she lamented spending another holiday alone, even though they were officially attached, but he told her 2003 would be different, and that they'd have many holidays together in the future. He double-checked that she had the number for the second cell phone he was taking with him to Europe, telling her he hoped it might have better reception overseas, already warning her that the coverage was spotty there, but he promised to write. But then he told her the airline gave him a $100 certificate for a masseuse at the airport, to compensate for his delayed flight, and he had to get off the phone so he could get his complimentary massage, but promised to call her back in 2 hours. The massage coupon was hard enough for Amber to believe, but his specific time frame to call her back struck her as abnormal as well. She never knew when she was going to hear from him, and he'd often failed to call as promised over the span of an entire day, so when he called back exactly 2 hours later, she was nearly certain something was up. Amber was at a friend's house when he called her cell phone and the connection was awful, but when she asked him to call Denise's landline, he said there was no time, his flight was boarding, and he had to go. This wasn't the first time he'd gotten weird about talking over a landline, successfully avoiding it, but he'd made several calls to her on payphones, and now he'd acquired a completely separate cell phone too. She told him to have a safe flight, but when she hung up she knew he was being shady somehow, and she wondered why he would plan to call at the exact time his plane was scheduled to board. It was all just too much, and she decided at that moment, it wasn't her trust issues that had her continuously revisiting her suspicions, but his shadowy behavior. That evening, as Sharon Rocha led Scott by the arm to an empty room at the volunteer center, seeking answers to her questions about Lacey, Amber and her friend Denise sat down at the computer, searching his name, looking for the truth as well. Unfortunately, they'd both come up empty-handed that night, but neither Sharon nor Amber were anywhere near prepared to drop the subject. Both women desperately wanted to trust him, and even though that had become more difficult with each passing day, Sharon desperately struggled with the prospect of his involvement. She'd received a call the night of the 28th, exhausted after her first private word with Scott since her daughter vanished, and she hesitated to even answer, but she did. It was the whispering woman, telling her Scott was having an affair. She'd given Sharon names and dates, all the while trying to stay quiet so her husband wouldn't hear. The tip turned out to be a dud, and Detective Brocchini, already known the whispering woman, made up the story when Sharon called him to report it. The prospect of Scott cheating began to terrify her by this point, but she still had enough trust in him to push those thoughts away, confident he wasn't capable of such selfish and deceptive behavior. Even as Brocchini asked her at the end of that call if she would be surprised to find her son-in-law had been unfaithful, she responded with an adamant yes. Yes, she would be absolutely shocked to learn that he'd cheated on her daughter. But Amber Frey would demolish his dam of lies just hours later, flooding Sharon with grief, flushing his betrayal out into the open, and eroding her last feeble hope of seeing Lacey again. The reward for her safe return had grown to $500,000 that same day, but the longer it remained active, the more confident investigators became about Scott's involvement. Chief Roy Waston later commented on the high reward, saying, quote, "Had anyone known about where Lacey was, had any information about where she was, and if she was alive, we would have heard about it," end quote. For investigators, the massive reward left unclaimed only bolstered their suspicions about Scott, and his weird phone call from the airport on the 28th had Amber convinced he was lying as well. That night, she left a message for her friend, Fresno detective Richard Byrd, to call her as soon as possible. On the morning of the 29th, Amber went to church, praying again for God to shed light on the truth, and that evening she met with Detective Byrd at his house, hoping to speed up the process. Byrd already thought Scott was a shady character, telling Amber that's why he called her sweetie, so he wouldn't mix her up with all of his other sweeties. Amber took it lightly, blowing it off as a joke, but Byrd wasn't laughing and started asking questions. How old is he? What does he drive? Where does he live? He wrote down every detail. Detective Byrd had a roommate named David Perez who also worked in law enforcement. Perez was assigned to some sort of special task force in Sacramento. Amber knew this, and it was part of the reason why she'd gone to Byrd and Perez for help. They used the computer at their house on the afternoon of the 29th to look into Scott, but she mentioned a database from the Department of Justice during an interview later, prompting questions about what they'd found that day, leading many to wonder if Amber knew more about Scott than she let on, much sooner than she'd claimed. Amber told Detective Bueller about Perez and the database, but asserted it wasn't accessed during their search for Scott that afternoon. This wouldn't be the last time questions cropped up surrounding what she knew and when, but we'll get into those details in a later episode. Amber's always insisted her timeline is accurate and truthful, and she clarified on the stand that Byrd and Perez never searched anything but Google while she was at their house that afternoon, but she did tell Bueller they still came up with a lot of stuff about Scott, though unfortunately, we don't have any details on what they found. She headed home, leaving Byrd and Perez to keep looking, promising to call her if they found anything. She met up with Sean Sibley later that evening, and they headed back to her Uncle Doug's house for another party. As Amber sat with Doug Sibley, complaining about Scott again, Detective Byrd called her cell phone. Just to clarify, Amber refers to Sean's uncle, Doug Sibley, as Paul Benson in her book, likely changing his name to afford some privacy, but whoever this man is, he comes up again in our next episode, in a far less fatherly and protective way. She answered the call from Byrd, who told her they'd found a Scott Lee Peterson who could be a match, but he was quick to tell her he wasn't sure if it was the same man. After hearing the Scott Peterson they found not only lived in Modesto, but was a person of interest in his wife's disappearance, Amber assumed they must have had the wrong guy. She doubted it was the same Scott, still thinking they would track him back to Sacramento, and it'd be crazy to think he could possibly be hiding that much from her, but she knew he was lying about something, and told Detective Byrd to keep looking. He promised to find out for sure, and to call her back with any news, however late it might be. Several hours passed with no word, and as it drew close to midnight, Amber must have been growing anxious about what they might find. Would they rule out the man in Modesto, or was it her Scott that was secretly married, and suspected of harming his pregnant wife? Sharon Rocha was likely awake pacing the floor with questions about Scott that night as well. Detectives had conducted their initial interview with Ron and Sharon that afternoon, and she'd come out of it a little rattled. Partially because she realized how little she was able to tell police about her son-in-law, but perhaps more concerned with Scott possibly having multiple degrees. When John Bueller asked Sharon about his other diplomas on the afternoon of the 29th, just around the time Amber sat with Byrd and Perez at the computer in Fresno, Sharon knew nothing about any diplomas aside from the one Scott earned at Cal Poly, and Detective Bueller wasn't inclined to share what they knew. Bueller's question wouldn't make sense to Sharon until the case went to trial, but the mention of degrees from other schools stuck with her, ramping up her suspicions about Scott early on. She knew he'd spent a year attending Arizona State before returning to California, and although he'd been honest about dropping out, she later learned he hadn't even completed the full year. Lacey'd already told her about Scott's relationship with a much older woman while he went to school there, and she was also aware he'd attended on a partial golf scholarship, but she didn't know much else. The small lie about how long he attended classes in Arizona had her wondering what his time at ASU was really like, and why he'd really dropped out. Scott's father Lee claimed he quit after realizing he didn't stack up to his teammates on the golf course, saying he was particularly intimidated by Phil Nicholson and couldn't perform at that level. But Scott played varsity golf through all 4 years of high school, and he was captain during his last year at the Catholic prep school in San Diego, leading the team to an undefeated season. He'd also been named Most Valuable Player twice by the time he graduated, and seemed to be very proud and vocal about his accomplishments. His friends and teammates were well aware that the Pugo Scott drove was a reward from his father for shooting par at 16, and that he thrived on the competition, having plans to go pro after college. Judging by his senior statement, he left for ASU with a positive outlook and full of confidence, writing, quote, "In the future, great things and good deeds await all of us, watch for me." If we're to believe Lee Peterson, all of Scott's optimism vanished before the end of his first semester away at school, causing him to give up his scholarship, head back to California to live with his parents and enroll in a community college, but it seems there might be a bit more to the story. It begins with a night of heavy drinking and chasing women on campus, and it ends with Scott being kicked off the golf team for corrupting a fellow teammate. Christopher Couch, who was the top-ranking junior golfer in the country at the time, joined Scott for the night out partying, but when his father Chip Couch heard about it, he went to the head coach complaining about the negative influence on Chris and his golf game. Apparently the coach sided with Chip and booted Scott off the team, though it still seems like something's missing from the story. If you ask Scott's adopted sister Ann, she'll tell you that his departure from ASU had nothing to do with golf, but everything to do with trying to avoid a scandal. She says Scott got a woman pregnant while at school in Arizona, and that she decided not to keep the baby. That may not seem like it's worth covering up and running from, but he was raised Catholic just like his mother, and he's been known to go to drastic measures to keep his image from being tarnished. The full truth about Scott's quick retreat from ASU is anyone's guess, but ironically, one of the diplomas police found when they served the search warrant was from Arizona State University, in religious studies. Of course, the degree was a fake, along with the 2 others from San Diego University in finance and psychology, but considering the rumors about his behavior there, and the accusations from Chip Couch, one might wonder whether his purchase of a religious studies degree from ASU might have been Scott's idea of a sarcastic joke. Scott claims it wasn't him that had ordered the fake diplomas, but that Lacey bought them as a gag gift. However, the email, phone number, and the $300 credit card receipt were all his. In the box labeled verification on the order form, he wrote, "I'm hoping nobody checks." As the party wound down in Fresno on the 29th of December, Amber's anxiety grew over what Detective Richard Bird was digging up about Scott. He called her at 1:40 a.m. on the 30th to confirm the horrible truth. Bird was certain now. Scott Lee Peterson lived in Modesto. His 8-month pregnant wife Lacey had been missing for a week, and he was a person of interest in her disappearance. They spoke for less than 3 minutes, just long enough for him to break the news and give her the number for the Modesto Police Department. He told her to contact them immediately, and she did, calling from the landline at Doug Sibley's house just 3 minutes later. She said she may have information about Scott Peterson, but when the woman asked what she knew, Amber refused to tell her anything, spending the bulk of the 22-minute call insisting she confirm his birth date before giving them any information. When the dispatcher finally came back on the line and told her it was October 24, 1972, Amber's heart sank, and she had trouble catching her breath as she explained that she'd been dating Scott Peterson. But the woman on the phone was unfazed, dull and monotone, not seeming to grasp the importance of what she'd just told her. "You don't understand, this guy's telling me he's in Europe, but he's here, and his pregnant wife's been missing for a week." But the dispatcher still didn't seem too concerned as she took Amber's information, nonchalantly telling her an officer would call her back. She nodded off for a while, but by 8 o'clock that morning, she still hadn't heard from anyone. Sean woke her up after finding a news broadcast about the case, and they watched together as Lacey's loved ones pleaded for her safe return. Not long after, she decided she was done waiting around for a phone call. At 8:41 a.m. on the 30th of December, Amber Fry called the tip line at the Volunteer Center in the Red Lion Hotel, where Al Brocchini was already hard at work, sifting through leads, hoping for a break that might take him to Lacey Peterson. Thanks so much for watching. Consider supporting the channel by clicking the Super Thanks button below, or by visiting our Patreon linked in the description. And if you liked the episode and want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when we post new content. As always, until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.